Mark 5, 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with the demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Kristen. For the past 2 months, we have been looking at these various spiritual practices, things like prayer or fasting, worship, things like this. And we've been saying that spiritual practices are God-given practices that are intended to lead us to more fully experience and to express God's love. That's what they're there for. They lead you into yourself being able to experience more of God's love and then to be able to express that out into the world. And today we're going to talk about the most dreaded of all of them, which is the practice of evangelism. Evangelism is the act of sharing, telling the gospel to someone else. The word evangel is just the Greek word gospel, and so evangelism is just gospeling. You're using your words to tell someone the good news. That's what gospel means, the good news of Jesus. Some people have used the words witnessing. Some people have used the language of sharing your faith. And, it's a very biblical idea. In John chapter 17, Jesus is praying for his disciples, and he prays that he sends them out into the world to engage a world that doesn't know him in the hopes that they would come to know him. In Matthew 28, Jesus is, that's where we get the what's referred to as the Great Commission, where Jesus commissions his disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations. If you read through the book of Acts, which is the book that we studied, we looked at in our group discussions here over the past year, you just have story after story after story of the church and Christians going out into the world and sharing the gospel, telling people who don't know Jesus about Jesus. So it's a very biblical idea. And but that was then, and here we are now, and in our current cultural moment, I think it's true that regardless of what you believe, if you consider yourself a Christian, not a Christian, don't know what you believe, trying to figure out what you believe, it doesn't matter. No one likes this. No one likes evangelism. In fact, I was reminded of an old Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. Not that I've ever seen that show, but I was reminded of an episode from one of the earlier seasons where, if you're familiar with the show, Larry David who himself is not a Christian. He's married to a woman on the show who is a Christian, and they have this conversation. I went back and found the exact scene that I was thinking of, and I transcribed it. I put it in your bulletin if you want to follow along. But here's what Larry David says to his wife. He says, "Why do Christians take everything so personally with Christ, you know? It's like it's not only do you have to worship him, you want everybody to. It's like, I like lobster. Do I go around pushing lobster on people? Do I say, you must like lobster, eat lobster, it's good, it's good. And you know, it's not only where you live, you go to Africa, you travel all over the world, eat lobster, have more lobster, it's good. We want you to have lobster." If you've ever heard Larry David speak before, maybe you can hear his voice saying, I can't do his New York Larry David-y, get lobster, it's good. Anyway, it's funny when he does it, but you see the point he's making. He's making fun of the fact of like, oh my goodness, you Christians, it's cool that you like Jesus, great, but don't go around pushing that on everybody else. Like that's like me going around saying, get lobster, you have to have it. It's like that's not cool. Don't do that. So here's someone who's not a Christian who says, we don't like this. Stop this. But here's what's fascinating. Is you have not just people who aren't Christians who don't like this, you have Christians who don't like this. There was a really fascinating study that Barna did recently, survey group. They've surveyed a big swath of Christians, people who say that they're Christians, and they asked them all these questions. One of the questions that they asked them was this: do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Here's the statement. It is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in hopes that one day they will share the same faith as you. So you get the question. They asked all these Christians, do you agree or disagree with this statement? It is wrong to share your personal beliefs with somebody in the hopes that maybe they'll come to believe what you believe. Here's some of the data. 19% of boomers. There's a hot take on boomers from Barna. 19% of boomers who are people between the ages of 59 to 77, 19% agreed with that statement. It is wrong for you to share your personal beliefs with somebody else. Gen Xers, who are people between the ages of 43 to 58, 27% agreed. It is wrong to share your personal faith with somebody in the hopes that they'll agree with you. Millennials, who are 27 years old through 42 years old, 47% agreed with that statement. It is wrong for you to share your faith with somebody else in the hopes that they'll come to believe you. They didn't even interview, Gen Zers are not on here, but you can see the trajectory. You can see the trend that there is this increasing percentage of the population, even amongst Bible-believing Christians, who say it is wrong to share your faith with someone else in the hopes that they might come to believe what you believe. So I get it. No one likes this. So why are we talking about this? Should we just close in prayer and hope that this goes away? We could, but we're not, and here's why. Because there's a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is the moment you say, evangelism isn't wrong, evangelism is wrong, and you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't impose your faith on other people. That's you doing evangelism. That's you imposing your faith on somebody else. The moment you say, you should not, it's cool for you to believe whatever you believe, but you should not impose your faith perspective on somebody else. You have to see that is you doing the very thing you said we should not do. You're imposing your faith perspective on someone else because your faith perspective might say, ultimate spiritual reality, it's not objective, it's subjective, and therefore everybody is free to believe whatever they want to believe. That is a unique, specific, particular faith perspective. And it is very different from what the majority of the world thinks about spiritual reality. That is a very new, a very white, a very European hot take on spiritual reality. So for you to say you should not impose your faith on anyone else, you're doing it. You just don't know that you're doing it. Mark Lilla is a humanities professor at Columbia University. And about 20 years ago, he wrote an article for the New York Times in the op-ed section, and the name of the article is called Getting Religion. And you can look this up. In this article, he tells a story about a previous time in his life. He's in New York, and he's taking the subway home one day, and he happens to get into this conversation with this young man, kind of a grad student, business school, who was coming home from a Billy Graham crusade, of all places. And this kid had just become a Christian, went to this Billy Graham crusade and became a Christian. And Mark Lilla was shocked and dumbfounded why this person who obviously seemed so bright and so smart could believe in something that in his mind was so stupid. And so here's what he writes in this article. It's fascinating. Here's what he says, quote, "When I heard this, I felt a professorial lecture welling up in my throat about the history and the psychology of religion. I wanted to expose him to the church's ambiguous role as incubator and stifler of human knowledge and the theological idiosyncrasy of American evangelicalism. I wanted to warn him against the anti-intellectualism of American religion today and the political abuses to which it is subject. I wanted to cast doubt on the step he was about to take to help him see that there are other ways to live, other ways to see knowledge and love and perhaps even self-transformation. I wanted to convince him that his dignity depended on maintaining a free, skeptical attitude towards doctrine. I wanted to save him." The curious thing about skepticism is that its adherents, ancient and modern, have so often been proselytizers. Now you see the irony. Of course, I mean, he's doing evangelism, or at least he wants to. He says, okay, here's somebody who believes something that I think is wrong. I disagree with that. I want them to think more like me. Disregard your Christian understanding of the world and adopt my skeptical, open-minded perspective of the world. And so the moment you say, you can't do that, that's you doing that. Here's the point. Evangelism is unavoidable. We're all doing it. We all have our understanding of the world that we think is right, and we're communicating that to other people, and sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't do it well. But the point is that it's unavoidable, and the moment you say you shouldn't do that, that's you doing that. Now, that's a very long introduction. But I think it's important because I'm trying to clear some of this debris out of the way because I know nobody in this room likes this, but we got to talk about it. So let's talk about it as a spiritual practice, and I want to look at three things for the rest of our time. Number one, what the gospel is. I mean, if evangelism means the gospel, then let's be clear on what it is. Number two, let's talk about what the gospel does. And then number three, where the gospel leads. Sound good? What the gospel is, what the gospel does, where the gospel leads. So let's talk about what the gospel is first, and we'll be brief. We can't look at this whole passage. This whole passage is long. We're just going to do a quick flyover it. But in this story, we get introduced to this man that Jesus meets. And what do we know about this man? Let me give you 4 quick details of what we know about this man. First of all, we know that he is unwell. It says in verse 2 that he has an unclean spirit, which means he's possessed by demons, which I know sounds bizarre to our ears. And so you came on a Sunday where you're not only getting evangelism, you're getting demon possession. I'm sorry, you're getting double whammy. But, in the least, he's mentally unwell. The Bible says he's consumed with evil, but obviously he is unwell. That's detail number 1. Detail number 2 is he has been written off by his community. If you look at verse 3, it says that he is so strong that nobody could bind him or chain him anymore, which implies that at one point they tried. They tried to restrain him, to protect him from harming himself or from harming other people, but he was too strong. He burst through, and they kind of gave up on him, and they just kind of wrote him off and let him live over here away from the rest of us as this crazy weirdo. So he's been written off. The third thing we know about him is that he's in pain. Verse 5, it tells us that he spends his nights crying out. He does not sleep at night because he's crying. It says he's taking stones and he's cutting himself. He's doing self-harm, self-injury, He's got a whole whirlwind of pain inside of him. Last detail I'll mention is that he's hopeless. It says in verse 3 that he lives among the tombs. So he's living in a graveyard. He's living in a, what we call a cemetery. That is the picture of hopelessness. This is someone who might as well be dead. He can't fix himself. The community can't fix him. Hopeless. So here's this man, and then the story goes on and shows us that Jesus just crashes into his life. Jesus shows up on the shore. He took a boat over there, and you find out in the chapter before, I didn't put this in your bulletin, but you find out in the chapter before, this was Jesus' idea to go over to the lake to where this guy was, to the country of the Gerasenes, as this passage says. So here's somebody who's not looking for Jesus, but Jesus comes looking for him. And then they have this whole conversation, and I won't get into it all, but Jesus engages with him and effectively, through his power, casts these demons out of this guy, sends him into this massive herd of pigs. The pigs run down the bank and then into the water, and they all drown and die. So here's this man who has been restored, who's been healed, who's been rescued. Look at what it says about him in verse 15. It says he's sitting there clothed, which is a detail that shows you previously he was not clothed, naked man running around the graveyard. But he's sitting there now clothed and in his right mind. He's gone from death to life. His very humanity has been restored to him. And so people from the village, this attracts attention, and they come to see what is going on. And when they see what happens, look at what they do in verse 17. I think this is fascinating. It says, they begged Jesus to depart from the region, which is understandable because these were pig herders. Their livelihood was raising and selling pigs, and Jesus just murdered them all, or they participated in getting rid of them all. So Jesus just wrecked the local economy, and they're like, we think you should leave. And so Jesus is about to depart, and before he departs, though, notice this, it's fascinating. There's a switch that happens. Here's the man who is rescued, and Jesus is rejected. Here's a man that gets liberated from suffering, and Jesus gets thrown into suffering. He's rejected. He's cast out. We want you to go away. But before Jesus leaves, this man asks Jesus, can I go with you? And Jesus says, no, I'm going to send you out to do something else. He sends him out to do evangelism. Look at what he says in verse 19. Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And in verse 20, he does. End of story. Now, I know that's weird. It's a very weird, bizarre story that raises more questions than we have time to answer today. But what I want you to at least see just from the structure of the story is you get the gospel in a nugget form. You get the gospel in sort of a nutshell. Because what's the story? Here's a man who is riddled with evil and problems, and he's hopeless, he's self-destructive. And the Bible says that's a picture of us. We showed up in the world unable to save ourselves, unable to rescue ourselves. We were just like this man, just completely hopeless. And yet, by unprovoked mercy, Jesus shows up and does something. Jesus shows up and rescues and restores us, not because of how good and beautiful we are. This guy is not good or beautiful in the story. Not because of how much potential we had. I mean, we weren't sitting around being good, nice people, volunteering at soup kitchens and praying. We were like this guy, completely consumed with ourselves, overwhelmed with pain and self-destruction. And Jesus comes barging in, purely by grace, and he suffers as a result of doing it. On the cross, Jesus is bearing all of our pain, all of our suffering, all of our sin, all of our failures. Jesus is not just being cast out of a village, he's being cast out of the presence of God so that you and I could be brought in. Here's the point. The gospel shows you, in a nutshell, it is God rescuing people who cannot rescue themselves. In fact, I love verse 19. I think Jesus is right in terms of emphasizing what he emphasizes. Of course, he's right. He's Jesus. But he says this, go tell them how much the Lord has done for you. That's the gospel. It's what Jesus has done for you, not for what you do for God. The gospel is not, God helps me become a better person. The gospel is not about what you must do. The gospel is a declaration of what God has done by his mercy. He rescues us. He doesn't give us homework. He rescues us. So if that's what the gospel is, this beautiful demonstration of God's mercy, and really not just to rescue individual broken people, but to ultimately rescue and renovate an entire broken world. But if that's what the gospel is, what does that have to do with evangelism? What does the gospel do in terms of how we talk about it? And there's so much that we could say under the second heading of what the gospel does, but let me just give you two quick things. Two things the gospel does as it relates to this subject. Number one, the gospel humbles you. The gospel humbles you. Have you ever seen how Christians debate people who are not Christians online? If you've ever read like the comment section of a Facebook post or a YouTube post and you see a Christian and like an atheist going back and forth, it's like, oh, it's the worst. It's so sickening. Because what you just see demonstrated from the Christian's point of view, we'll just make fun of the Christians, is we can just exude pride, smugness, self-righteousness. We are right and you are wrong and you're an idiot. And I cannot believe that you can't see it. And so Christians, we're not good at talking. We're not good at talking about the gospel because we have this unchecked self-righteousness. But here's the thing. If the gospel is true, you know what the gospel tells you? You're a sinner saved by grace. If that's true, if that's what the gospel is, that obliterates pride. That obliterates self-righteousness. You should have an instinct where you move through life, if you believe that to be true, where you just assume everyone around you is a better person than you. Your neighbors who aren't Christians, who don't believe what you believe, you just assume they're probably a better spouse, a better citizen, a better parent, a better roommate, a better child than I am. Because you just assume, because you're a sinner saved by grace. You're not saved by being more moral than other people or by being smarter or more spiritually sensitive. You were like the guy in the story, unable to do anything, and Jesus rescues you. Do you think when this guy went back into this village where Jesus sent him to go and tell people what Jesus has done for him, do you think he walked into that village with his chest puffed out thinking he's the man now? 4 seconds ago, he was naked and screaming and just kind of being, like he was walking into a village of people that were wiser than him, that have spent a lot more time loving their community, loving their families, serving their neighbors, way more than he was. I'm guessing he did not walk in with any swagger. He walked in humble because the gospel humbles you. You're a sinner saved by grace, which means you just have a built-in respect for other people. A built-in assumption, I have a lot to learn from other people who believe things differently than me, who have different understandings of the world than me. I've got a lot to learn from them. I'm free to disagree with them, but they're probably a lot wiser or more thought out than I am. So that's the first thing, is the gospel humbles you. Here's the second thing, the gospel emboldens you. The gospel also emboldens you. I heard Tim Keller's a pastor in New York, served there for many years, but he once said that there are types of Christians who all of their friendships are only with Christians. All of their friends are just with people that they know from church or ministries or whatever. And he calls them bubble Christians. They've just withdrawn into a bubble. And he says there's other types of Christians that are the opposite. They know everybody. They're networked. Tons of people know them. They've just a big social connection. But nobody knows that they are a Christian because they've hidden it, and he calls them private Christians. They're out there, they know a bunch of people, but nobody would ever know that they go to church. No one would think that they believe anything about Jesus. So he says bubble Christians and private Christians, they both struggle with the same thing. They're both afraid. Both of these types of people are afraid if someone finds out that you're a Christian, they're not going to like it. They're not going to like you. They'll disapprove of you. We're afraid of feeling stupid. We're afraid of being seen as a bigot or being lumped into a category of Christians that you yourself aren't thrilled about to be associated with. I mean, I get it. I want people to like me. I hate it when I meet new people and they ask me what I do for a living because I got to tell them. And I tell them I'm a Christian pastor. I can't hide it like some of you can. You can hide it. This is the first thing out of my mouth. I'm a pastor. And things immediately get weird, always. So I get it, but here's the reality. The gospel tells you, not only are you a sinner saved by grace, but the reason why he saves you by grace is because he loves you. That's who your identity, that's who you are. Your identity is that you are beloved. That is core to your understanding of self, which means, yes, people might reject you, people might think you're crazy, people might write you off as a weirdo or whatever. None of that's comfortable. No one likes to experience that. But the reality is it does not threaten the core of who you are. And the more you lean into that core reality, that who you are loved, delighted in, treasured by the God of the universe, that frees you to take risks. Because you don't need the validation of the world in the same way that you did before. You can risk it. They might think you're crazy. They might think you're, okay, I wish they wouldn't, but they might. And it doesn't change the fact that you are loved. You know, it's interesting, when Jesus sends this guy that he interacts with in the story, he does not send him to a foreign country. He sends him back home to his friends and his family and his network of people that know his story. People over there would have known nothing about him. He would have just walked in, been able to talk about Jesus, but he sends him back to a community of people that know his background. Do you think that they were open and receptive to hearing this guy talk about Jesus? Here's a guy that in their community, this guy was Boo Radley in their community. You're the dangerous weirdo that we've kind of written off, and now you're going to come back into our village and talk to us about like spiritual things? This guy had to have known when I go back in and I talk to them about Jesus, they're going to laugh at me. And they probably did, but he did it anyway. Because he had an experience of God's love and his grace, and the gospel emboldened him. That's what the gospel does. It humbles you on the one hand, but it also emboldens you on the other. A lot more I could say about that, but I'll stop. Here's the third thing. Where does the gospel lead us? If that's what the gospel is, we're sinners saved by grace. God rescues us through Jesus, completely by his mercy. If that's what the gospel does, it humbles us, it emboldens us. Where does the gospel lead us? And what I mean by this is I'm just trying to give you some practical takeaways from this. I know not everybody in this room is a Christian. Not everybody in this room would claim, yes, I believe the gospel. That's something I embrace. Maybe you're here, you're trying on Christianity, you're checking things out, you're exploring what you believe. That's great. You're always welcome to do that here. This last point is really more directed to those of us in the room that would say, I believe it. I consider myself a Christian, sinner saved by grace, loved by God. Okay, where does the gospel lead us? 3 quick practical takeaways. The first thing is this: start close. Start close. Like I said a second ago, Jesus does not send this guy to a foreign country. He sends him back into his pre-existing network of relationships. He has him start close. So if you're sitting here and you're thinking, okay, what do I do with this? Do I just go up to random, people? No, start close. Have you had your neighbors over for dinner? Not to roll out a PowerPoint presentation about Jesus, but just to get to know your neighbors. Have you been intentional about getting to know the people that you work with or the people that you see at the gym every time you go work out. That's all I'm saying, is just be intentional about moving towards people that are in your natural network of people. Start close. Here's the second one. As you interact with people, I really don't know how to say this. I'll say it the way that I planned on saying it. There's a better way to say it, but I don't know how to say it. Be normal. You know, Christians can be so weird with this subject for some reason. I don't understand it. Christians can get into this mindset where it's like, okay, the takeaway is I'm going to go up to random strangers and barge into their life and ask them what they think about Jesus. And you can do that. I know God has used that in people's lives, so I can't knock that. And at the same time, I know that in our current cultural moment, that's a little off-putting. I don't think people like that. I've also seen Christians do a lot of weird bait and switch stuff where we try to trick people into having conversations about Jesus. We manipulate them. I don't recommend that either. I just recommend being normal. And what I mean by that is just letting, as people get to know you, you just don't hide this part of your life. It's really easy for Christians to, we quarantine our faith over here. We hope nobody asks about it. We don't want to talk about it with them. And we want to kind of remain status quo where we're liked and seen as respectable. We just hope and pray nobody asks us about spiritual stuff. That's really weird when you think about it, because the way normal relationships function is as you get to know another human being, you start to get to know more stuff about each other's lives. You share more stuff with each other. That's what's normal. So to hide a giant piece of your life is weird. Don't be weird, be normal. Tim Keller, again, once said, don't do friendship evangelism. Friendship evangelism is turning another human being into a project of yours. He says, don't do friendship evangelism. He says, just do friendship and don't hide, which I think is a good way to put it. Maybe that's a little bit better than be normal. Here's the third thing, last thing. Believe the gospel for yourself as it relates to your own evangelism. Believe the gospel for you. And here's what I mean by that. I'm getting this last point from a friend of mine, Brian Habig, who I heard share a story once where he was one of his friends who was a campus minister, so a pastor that worked with college students. This campus minister was working with this one guy who was a Christian on campus, who was in a fraternity, and they were talking together about how to reach out to the guys in his fraternity. He says, the campus minister is saying, hey, you have this whole network of guys that you live with and do life with. What would it look like to start to think about how to engage in them with the gospel? So they talk about it. They come up with a game plan. They pray about it. And, okay, they depart. A few weeks later, they get back together. The campus minister checks in on them. Hey, how did it go? How did it go with reaching out to the guys that you live with? And the guy says, well, I didn't do it. Totally chickened out. It felt so weird and so awkward. I just couldn't do it. And the campus minister had the wherewithal that in that moment he said, you know what? Jesus died for that too. You'll be okay. He didn't say, whoa, that is really disappointing. Let's make a pact, you and me, right now, and I'm going to hold you accountable to this so that next time you go and do that, and you're going to come back and you won't be such a disappointment. He says, you know what? Grace is big enough that covers our cowardice. It covers our embarrassment of him. Jesus died for that too. And they go out. A few weeks later, they get back together. They check in with each other, and the campus minister says, okay, I got to ask you, because I've been hearing stories that you've just been telling everybody about Jesus. What in the world happened? A few weeks ago, last time we met, you were all scared and weirded out about it, and now you're talking to everybody about it. What happened? And the student says, well, the last time we got together, and you said, well, Jesus dies even for our fear of telling other people about him. I thought that was so cool, I just started telling everybody about him. You know what happened? In that moment, grace motivated him. If you consider yourself a Christian and you walk out of these doors and in a few months you lift up your head and you look up and you say, okay, I have not applied one word of what I heard that Sunday morning. I haven't talked about Jesus to anybody. I haven't talked about the gospel to anybody. Shame is not going to help you. Pressure from me up front scolding you. It's not going to help you. The good news is Jesus died for reluctant evangelists like me and like you. And that is such good news. Maybe it will help us feel more free to talk about him. Believe the gospel for yourself as it relates to your own failures in evangelism. That's an invitation for you this morning. Let me pray for us. Oh, Father in heaven, I pray that as we think about and talk about a subject that for many of us just triggers guilt or confusion or shame or anger, that you would drill the gospel of grace deeper and deeper into our own hearts, that we might be convinced afresh that it is such good news, and that we might feel more free to share it with folks, not to be preachy, not to feel like we got to check a box, but because we just love to talk about the things that we love. So would you help us to love you? Would you open up our eyes to see the beauty and the wonder of grace, the wonder of your mercy towards us, and would that help us to talk about you with our friends and with our neighbors in a way that is humble and gracious and winsome and not domineering, and only you can create this kind of person. Only you can do this deep work in us. So would you please do so? Help us to be wonderful listeners, good question askers, and people who exude not pride, but grace. We ask all this in Jesus' name.